Welkom terug. Ons sit ons gesprek voor saam met Keegan Leech en hy is natuurlik 'n navorser by Africa Check en ons gesels oor die manifeste van sekere politieke partye. En ons begin vanoggend sommer by Rise Mzansi. So I'm going to ask you, Keegan, what are some of the facts that you checked and what are some of your findings that you had?
Well, we checked a selection. We can't go through them all on air today, but there's a couple of interesting ones that I thought would be fun to talk about. So, for example, one of Rise Mzansi's claims was that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. And this is actually a claim that lots of people make. And it's an interesting one because it's a good look at how there might be more complexity behind a claim than it first appears.
When you're saying that, yes.
Absolutely. In this case, we're looking at something called the Gini coefficient. It's the measure of inequality that's most commonly used. It's a number from 0 to 1, which represents sort of what the wealth distribution is in a country. If everyone owned the same amount of wealth, the Gini coefficient of that country would be 0. If one person owned all the wealth, it would be 1. South Africa's is about 0.63 or 0.67, depending on what measure you use. And that is higher than essentially every other country in most rankings of Gini coefficients. But there's a bit of complexity to this because not every country is represented in those rankings. There's some countries, like some of the Gulf countries, which might have high wealth inequality, which aren't represented. And every country's data isn't necessarily perfectly comparable. So they're collected slightly differently, using slightly different methods, and it means that not every country is going to have the same sort of standard for how that is measured. So we rated that claim mostly correct because it is accurate, although as a researcher from WITS told us, ideally what you should be saying is we're the most unequal country in the world for the countries which we have data.
Okay, so that's quite specific and that makes sense. Unemployment is worse now?
Yes. Unemployment is worse now than it was in 1994. Was that Rise Mzansi's claim?
Yes.
That's true. That's something that Stats SA collects data on pretty regularly, and unemployment rates have risen recently. There was obviously an unusual little blip during the COVID pandemic when unemployment actually dipped briefly, and that's just because the way Stats SA collects unemployment data, people who couldn't work were not counted. But unemployment is, as we know, quite high.
Another one that they made is there are more cases of food insecurity and hunger today than there were in 1994, also Rise Mzansi.
This is another complex one. The general trend for food insecurity and hunger is that the prevalence of both has decreased. There have been slight increases. Again, during the pandemic, there was a spike. But overall, if you take a slice of data from 20 years ago and a slice from today, hunger and food insecurity have dropped. And this was even the case in the sources that Rise Mzansi sent us to back up their claim. But we rated this unproven because while the general trend is for things falling, we can't say that this is outright false for two main reasons. The first is that they have talked about absolute numbers instead of prevalence, which isn't the standard. It's not how researchers who discuss this topic typically measure it, because it's possible for a small percentage of people to represent a large number when the population grows. But also, and more importantly, we don't have data going all the way back to 1994. Stats SA's General Household Survey started in 2002. And it doesn't quite reach back far enough. So we can't say for sure that even though hunger has fallen, it is definitely lower than it was in 1994.
Wow. Okay, so let's look at some of the EFF's claims. So their first claim was 80% of the population occupies less than 10% of South Africa's land.
That almost makes sense for an average oak like me. I mean, cities, you know.
That's a good thing to factor in there because what land is actually built on is a tiny proportion of the country.
Yeah.
So something like 3% of South Africa's land is built up, which means urban areas and mines. But that's not what the EFF was actually concerned about. We fact-checked this in their 2019 manifesto as well, and at the time, they sent us their reasoning behind this. They explained that what they'd done was subtracted from South Africa's total land what they called white-owned agricultural land, state-owned land, and land owned by Indians. And they said that that left 14% of land to be owned by black and colored South Africans. And that's inaccurate. The biggest issue there with their calculation is that they're using out-of-date and incorrect figures. Worst of all, the 67% of land that they called white-owned agricultural land was agricultural land as it stood in 1994.
Oh, wow.
Obviously, that's not relevant to land today. Yeah. The best land ownership data we have is unfortunately still a little bit old. It's from 2015. It was published in the 2017 Land Audit Report. It shows that there is a massive disparity in land ownership, but it's a bit more complicated, again, than the EFF has made it out to be. So we can only find out the race of the owner of a piece of land for a category of land called privately owned, individually owned land.
Individuals, yeah.
And that is mostly dominated in terms of sheer acreage by agricultural land. When it comes to agricultural land, black South Africans own about 4% of it compared to white South Africans who own 72%. So there is a massive disparity, but it's not quite what the EFF is presenting, and it's not quite the figures they're presenting. Even if we only look at that small slice of land, which is about 30% of all land, then either black South Africans own about 4%, or black and colored South Africans, which is how the EFF presented it to us in 2019, own about 20%. So their numbers are off either way.
Okay. Wow. Keegan, that's all we have for time for, unfortunately, but we'd love to have you back just to go over some of these facts. It really is
some
interesting.
Of the other parties as well.
Yes, it really, really is very interesting to hear what you have to say about this. So thank you also for all your work you're doing, and for Africa Check and making sure that we know what the true facts are.
It's a pleasure.
Wow.
Nou ja, deur die natuur gekweek en deur die koning beskerm vir gemoedsrus vir jou vrugteoes. Besoek King Price